Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is Alexa Winnick. I'm an associate editor here at Crossroad Bible Institute, and I'm filling in today for Dr. Schuringa, the host of our program. If you're a faithful viewer of Crossroad Connection, it's possible you've heard the term restorative justice used from time to time on our shows. But perhaps you've wondered, what does restorative justice look like, hands-on with real-life situations and real people? Or perhaps you've wondered what it looks like from the perspective of a victim of a crime. So we have in the studio with us today someone who can hopefully shed some light on those questions. So we have John Wilmot with us. He is the director of the Restorative Justice Coalition of West Michigan. So welcome, John, to our program.
Thank you so much, Alexa. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's really great to have you here today to talk about this. I thought might be great for our viewers to start off with a bit of a refresher on restorative justice, since you have that great hands-on perspective of that.
Sure. Restorative justice means a lot of different things to different people.
Sure.
I think what we share in common is a view that crime isn't merely a broken law, but a broken relationship, and that justice should be about healing those relationships and creating a safe and peaceful community.
Sure. Yeah, I was reading an article this morning, actually, that took kind of an interesting spiritual approach to that, where it said restorative justice is, restoring relationships between people, with ourselves, and with our communities, and with God. And that was a good, overall kind of perspective on that. So for you, as the director of the Restorative Justice Coalition, what does that look like in terms of working with victims of crimes?
Well, we are an advocacy organization.
Right.
We promote restorative justice programs and principles in the community. We are a group of volunteers who work in different areas of the justice system or community and social services and education. And
Right.
we just want to see our community move away from a retributive or a punitive process to more of a restorative one.
Okay. So when you talk about this punitive approach, to me that sounds like, we often tend to focus on offenders or the people committing the crimes. So where does the victim come into play with restorative justice?
Well, if you've followed the victims' rights movement, you'll recall that victims of crime really have only had rights in the criminal justice system for the last 30 years.
Okay.
It was in 1984 that Congress passed, and then President Reagan signed the Victims of Crime Act, which was the first time that we had some clear legislation granting victims of crime rights in our justice system.
Okay, that's interesting. What are some of those rights, like specifically?
Sure. Well, prior to 1984, victims really didn't even have any right to information. Was there an arrest made? Was somebody charged? They would likely find out if they were subpoenaed to court to testify as a witness. But if they weren't, good chance they wouldn't have ever heard the outcome of the investigation or the case. So the right to information is one of the primary rights.
Sure, knowledge is power.
Yes,
Many times, yeah.
The right to be present at any court proceeding, the right to consult with the prosecuting attorney or district attorney, the right to restitution, and the right to make an impact statement to the court at the time of sentencing. Okay. Those are some of the rights that victims now have.
Wow, okay. So for a victim of a crime, when a crime is committed against someone, when the shalom of a community is broken or compromised, what goes on inside a victim? Or is there like a process of, victimization that happens after that? Like, what is that like for them?
Research is telling us a lot about the process or the occurrence of victimization.
Sure.
We know that there's some real biological things going on. Our brain chemistry is affected when we go through trauma. A lot of times what victims experience is just that loss of control. the feeling that the world is falling apart around them. Safety, we know, is the number one thing that victims need. They need that sense of security, that return to normalcy of being able to just live their life each day, not in fear. But victims also need information, and information, as you said, it is empowering.
Right.
When you have information, you're in the know. You're regaining that sense of control over your life.
Yeah, for sure.
Many victims have the need to be part of the justice process.
Right. That's what I was curious about, is how many, from your experience, do you see are victims anxious to be a part of the court system? I imagine there's a whole spectrum and range of situations and different kinds of crimes committed. But is there a pattern that you see that people find that empowering or healing to do that?
It does vary a lot by the type of crime, and we have so many different kinds of people.
Yeah.
We have so many different kinds of victims.
Sure.
So some victims really don't want to participate in the justice system, and that should be their right. But many victims, and in my experience, a majority of victims, do want to be involved to some level, whether it just simply be attending a court proceeding or at least being informed of what the outcome is. Some victims want to be very involved and consult with the prosecutor and attend the hearings and give an impact statement. They're involved sometimes even at the probation level and giving input into restitution and having input into either treatment programs or some desire to see that the offender better themselves.
Okay. And this all falls into restorative justice because, what would you say to that?
Well, victims' rights is, I think, the heart of restorative justice. If justice should be anything, it should be about repairing the harm done to the victim of the crime. And so a real just process would be one that focuses on the needs of the victim primarily.
Right.
And in my experience, I've really learned that if we want to know best how to hold an offender accountable, look at the needs of the victim.
Okay.
So even if our focus is on the offender, we get our best direction by looking at the needs of the victim.
Okay. So what processes are in place right now to find out, what the needs of the victim are in a situation? And have you been involved with some of those processes yourself?
Well, we've come a long way, and our justice system is continuing to make progress.
Little by little.
In recognizing the needs of victims and working with victims, and furthering victims' rights. So now we have law enforcement, many of whom have had at least some basic level of training in how to work with crime victims. We have, in Michigan, every county prosecutor's office has a victims' rights coordinator whose job it is to notify crime victims of their rights under Michigan law. We have similar thing at the federal level. And now, after the Victims of Crime Act, which was passed in '84, all 50 states have passed their own version of victims' rights legislation. So now we have some level of victims' rights in all 50 states.
Wow.
So all of our courts throughout the United States have come on board with victims' rights, are beginning to recognize that justice should include victims, and that we should be sensitive towards victims' needs.
Sure. Now, it sounds, in some ways that it's been like a long process, or these steps take a while to, be implemented in the justice system. Are there naysayers to this focus on victims' rights and, bringing healing to both victims and offenders and together?
Well, the path of the victims' rights movement has been a rocky one. There's been a lot of resistance, even from some judges, from prosecutors, from law enforcement, from defense attorneys, probation and parole departments, fear of the unknown. I've always thought that our justice system shouldn't chase every new fad. It should be fairly slow to change, but it should be very clear now that crime victims
need to be part of that process.
Yes, they play a very important role in our justice system, and as they should.
Yes.
And so I've seen a lot of progress made. One example is in the area of restitution.
Okay.
In Michigan, the initial crime victims legislation said that the judges could order restitution, and then it became they should, and now it's they shall. And so judges have slowly come along.
Okay.
Some of them were quicker to embrace restitution than others, but now it's pretty well complied with the idea that any out-of-pocket financial loss by a crime victim shall be ordered in restitution.
Okay.
So we've made progress in the area of restitution and some of these other victims' rights.
Sure. John, you're very knowledgeable about this topic, clearly, and passionate. I'm curious to know what set you on this trajectory to get involved with restorative justice, like in your own personal life. Was it one moment or more of a gradual process?
I can remember as a freshman in college at Houghton College in Western New York, and not having any money, a few bucks to my name, but after I had bought my books for my classes that second semester, I was in the bookstore and there was a book that just grabbed my attention, and so what few dollars I had left to my name I spent on this book that I didn't need. It was Convicted by Chuck Colson, and it was an introductory book to this idea of restorative justice, and God put in me a passion for this topic and to be part of this movement.
Great. Well, we're quite familiar with Chuck Colson's work over here, in prison fellowship and all that. So great. And clearly this has led you to become the director of the Restorative Justice Coalition all those years later. And I would love to dive into that and talk more about that after the break. So stay with us. There's more for John Wilmot after the break.
Stay connected to what's happening at Crossroad Bible Institute with Crossroad Network News. This free magazine is designed to keep you informed and inspired about what Christ Church is doing in prisons and jails. If you'd like a free subscription to Crossroad Network News, fill out the form online by visiting us at cbi.fm.
Welcome back to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking with John Wilmot today about restorative justice and the rights of victims of crimes. And we were just discussing your journey, what took you along the way to become the director of the Restorative Justice Coalition of West Michigan. So I was wondering, John, what is the coalition doing right now in regards to its mission? Are there any exciting things coming down the pipe with that?
Yeah, very exciting right now. Our focus is on helping schools reevaluate their discipline systems and their policies.
It's a big job.
It is. Well, there is just a growing concern over the school-to-prison pipeline. We know that students who are suspended or expelled are more likely to drop out of school and not graduate. And we know that youth who do not graduate from high school are more likely to end up in prison. The data is pretty clear on these. So there's a growing recognition among many that we need to reevaluate the way schools do discipline. And so I'm actually right now have the opportunity to be part of the Kent County School and Justice Committee.
Okay.
And we are working on a plan to reduce the number of youth who are referred from schools to juvenile court. We're working on trying to implement more restorative practices, promote some new approaches in the schools to discipline. And so the Restorative Justice Coalition is a partner in this process. We're partnering with some of the school districts, and And we're really excited about some of the changes that we're seeing.
Sure. Yeah, I want to jump in here real quick. I know there was an article that MLive did last year that kind of highlighted this new program that's coming up. And you have a great quote in there, and I wanted to run that by you. You said, "There are a number of school districts around the country and in Michigan awakening to the reality that the way districts have done discipline does not work. The approach to discipline in the schools mirrors our adult criminal justice policy, in which we have a predominantly offender focus that takes a punitive approach." I was wondering if you would comment on that last part of that sentence about comparing our school discipline with the adult criminal justice system and the punitive nature of it.
Our adult justice system is the criminal justice system. It's primarily about the criminal. I think like 98% of the expenditures in our justice system are towards the offender.
Wow.
I had one professor call it the trail 'em, nail 'em, jail 'em process.
Oh, wow.
And that's very much the focus of our law enforcement, of our courts, of
Sure.
our corrections, is on the offender.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that we have a very punitive justice system. We ask ourselves, what law was broken? Who broke it, and how do we punish that person?
That's where our thoughts go first in those situations.
That is. That's the way our justice system has where our justice
Sure.
system has ended up after.
So then I would ask you, what would be the more restorative justice approach to that, like in terms of questions you would ask?
A restorative approach would ask different questions.
Yeah.
First of all, who was harmed? How do we repair that harm? And then whose obligation is it to repair the harm? So it's a very victim-centric approach. Restorative justice is all about restoring the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole.
So like ripple effect, it moves out from the victim.
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, that concept of shalom, that peace, that unity that the community should have.
Sure. So going back to the school program, what are some of these like creative or practical ways that you foresee being piloted with this program?
Too many schools have discipline systems that are just based on what we've always done. This is the way we've always done it.
Sure.
When a student breaks the rule and they have a bad attitude, well, then we suspend them. We send them home. We kick them out of school for a certain number of days,
Which
3 or 5.
perpetuates what you were saying, that school to prison pipeline, which is a great, I think, metaphor for us to think about this.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we have to ask ourselves, what does suspension really accomplish? We suspend because that just seems like the way we've always done it.
Right.
But have we stopped and asked ourselves, what are we accomplishing?
This is helping.
And much like incarceration, which is a very passive form of punishment, do the crime, do the time, a passive thing. Suspending a student, kicking them out of school, is also a passive punishment. What we need to do is teach our young people how to take responsibility. We have to figure out different ways in which we can actively hold them accountable.
Right.
And if we look again at the needs of the victim, a lot of times we get ideas. So if a student has done vandalism, well, the first thing we should do is have them fix it, clean it up, pay to repair it. If there is a student fight, we should have those students talk about what happened and come up with a resolution to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if there's damages, well, those need to be taken care of. And the offending party would need to be responsible for that.
Sure, but there's an intentionality and a relationship that's going on between, the person that did the crime or the infraction.
Yes,
and
one
the victim.
element of discipline is to teach. And schools need to return to this idea that any misbehavior is an opportunity to teach a student responsibility and better choices, and not just as a broken rule that needs to be punished.
Right. It's about the human part of that, and repairing whatever has been broken inside that person as well.
Yes.
It's a great way to talk about it as a teaching moment. Yeah, that's great. So specifically, I read something about conferences or circles and conferences that you're doing with the students. Is that part of it as well?
Sure. Many schools are embracing restorative practices. And restorative practices would include things such as traditional mediation, family group or victim offender conferencing, circles, classroom circles, peacemaking circles. There's many variations of that. And there's other models of dialogue and restorative practices as well, but those are the main ones.
Okay.
And they're proving very effective in schools.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, if what progress you were seeing after it's been piloted for these few months. Is there any any progress that you're charting?
Yes. Well, there's many. We've heard of schools who have reduced their rates of suspension by 30, 40, 50, even 70% in 1 year by embracing restorative practices.
Wow. Well, I'd love to hear more examples. We're going to take a break here real quick, and then we can talk some more about it after the break. So we'll be right back after this.
Crossroad Bible Institute is a nonprofit organization that relies on financial donations from faithful supporters. These donations ensure that we will be able to continue offering services to people in prison to bring them the truth of God's Word. To make a tax-deductible donation or to find out more ways to help, please visit us at cbi.fm on the web.
Welcome back to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking with John Wilmot, and before the break we had been discussing the strides that the Restorative Justice Coalition has taken to implement more restorative practices in the public school system here in Grand Rapids. And I would just love to hear, and I'm sure our viewers would as well, any success stories specifically that you've experienced through this program, or even other experiences you've had as a director of the Restorative Justice Coalition.
One of my favorite stories is a case I facilitated a few years back. There were a few middle school boys who had, on a Saturday, been outside the school building playing ball.
Okay.
They asked the school custodian who was there working that day to let them in to use the drinking fountain.
Mm-hmm.
What the custodian didn't know is that the boys had propped the door open when they left so that they could return that night and get into the school. Well, they did, and they caused some damage and a little bit of vandalism, and they stole a set of keys from the school. So they were caught, and the case was referred to our conferencing program.
Okay.
And I had an opportunity to meet with the boys, who were all remorseful. They knew they made bad choices.
Sure.
They knew they messed up. The parents were embarrassed. They were frustrated. Thankfully, the juvenile court recognized that this case may have a better outcome if the boys were given a chance to take responsibility.
Instead of sending them to a detention center or something.
Right.
Is that the idea?
Through just, or even just simple probation and fines and stuff. But they really needed to understand how their actions affected others. So I met with some representatives at the school, the principal, the custodian who was working that day, and a couple others. We ended up just having a big group meeting one evening at the school. The boys were there with their parents and representatives from the school. We just talked about what happened. The boys had to explain what they did. And then the folks from the school had a chance to ask questions. Well, what did you do next? What did you do with the keys?
So there's a whole dialogue.
There is a dialogue going back and forth. And there's we're beginning to see the boys, their eyes open to the reality that they didn't just break a rule or break a law, that they caused a lot of pain and frustration for other people. So the custodian did a great job as she talked about the personal betrayal that she felt by the boys that day, taking advantage of her kindness.
Right.
And so they talked about it. We had a great meeting. They came up with a solution that everybody thought was fair, and how the boys could repay the school and actually work off a lot of the expense and damages that they did.
Wow.
So
that's a great story.
It
Yeah.
is. And so each of the boys, I think, worked at the school a week that summer. And the last boy to do his week of work was kind of the ringleader. And he was the one who actually stole the keys, which included the master key for the building. So there was considerable expense because they had to re-key all of the locks in the building. And on his last day of work, as the custodian told me later, that they were really busy that day with different projects, and she had forgotten about a project, and somebody asked her to go attend to something, and she couldn't leave what she was doing, but she had to go someplace else and get something. And she said she had, I'll call him David. She had David there working with her that day, and instead of trying to figure out how to be in two places at once, she asked David to go down to the storage closet and get the item that was needed. And he started down the hallway and was happy to help out and working hard. And she realized as he had gotten a little ways down the hallway that he was going to need a key to get in the closet. And so she yelled his name, David, and she tossed him her set of keys.
Wow.
And she said he turned around and he extended his hands and he caught them and he just looked at the keys and looked up at her and paused and just smiled. He says, I'll get these right back to you.
Wow.
And so it was
like
kind
a
of
symbolic moment.
It was
in
a
many
very
ways
redemptive moment for the youngster. And
that's what you would hope, ideally, and I'm sure it doesn't always happen that way, but from the small examples like that to the more extreme, that we would just hope, especially, as, Christians or people involved with prison ministry, from our perspective, that redemption can come full circle like that for people. That's really great.
Accountability is an important part of the justice process or of the school discipline process. And if we can shift our focus away from punishment and more towards active accountability, we will help ourselves so much. We will restore victims. We will restore offenders, and we'll have a much safer and peaceful community. So I encourage principals, and I encourage those who work in the justice system to think more in terms of accountability rather than just punishment.
Right. I think that's a great place to end right there. But before we go, where can people go to find out more about either the Restorative Justice Coalition or Rights of Victims, which we talked about earlier in the program?
Yes, the Restorative Justice Coalition website.
Okay.
Which
we'll have that on the screen for you. Yeah.
Thank
I think if you just even type into Google Restorative Justice Coalition of West Michigan, you'll find it very easily there. We'll have all the information on the screen. But is that where people will find more information?
Yeah, there's lots of information out there. There's lots of great things happening even here in West Michigan. And so,
especially with the school system and all that's coming down in the next year for that. That's exciting.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, John. It's been great to chat with you about this really important issue for our justice system, I think.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you for joining us for another episode of Crossroad Connection. We look forward to seeing you again right here next week.